I wanted to start this series with an album that I consider to be my favourite of the era. It's also a very, very important album, so there's no real conflict there. But My Chemical Romance's Three Cheers for Sweet Revenge. The band's debut, I Bought You My Bullets, You Brought Me Your Love. I haven't decided not to cover that in a full essay, but I very well could have. It's an extremely interesting album, but it's not really a surprise that it had the response that it did. This is a really underground album we're talking about. This is an album with no real singles. Great songs, fantastic songs, some of my favourites. Honey, This Mirror Isn't Big Enough for the Both of Us is a particularly fond of. Obviously there's songs like Vampires Will Never Hurt You that are incredibly important for the band as aesthetically and in terms of their vibe. So there's great songs on here, but it just was never going to cross over. They weren't writing singles then. They were writing stuff for themselves, but very influenced by the scene around them. And this comes on to the kind of authenticity of the album. You know, this is a real product of the New Jersey post-hardcore scene. It's fast, furious, and it's slightly confrontational. This isn't an easy listen album. This is really influenced by their peers. You have bands like Thursday, you have Jeff Rickley that produced the album. It's very much a product of that era and localized era on that kind of New Jersey, New York kind of hardcore scene that was going on. And then the other thing that's interesting about this is that it does sort of showcase their unique identity. Their identity as essentially comic book nerds. This is an album that really isn't necessarily drawing from the same themes and ideas as their peers. There's not a lot of songs about heartbreak on here. There's not a lot of songs about, certainly no songs about girls in quotation marks. This isn't an album about relationships in the typical sense. We're talking about lust. We're talking about possession. We're talking about defending your lover from vampires. Interestingly, Vampires Will Never Hurt You, I always thought was a really particularly interesting title. The title to me always spoke as Vampires Will Never Hurt You, as in vampires are not a threat to you, or vampires are sort of misunderstood in a kind of way. Vampires is a kind of outsider that you've been taught to be suspicious of, but are actually not a threat to you. I always thought that was very interesting, and that's sort of how I read it. But obviously, you can read it as a straightforward "vampires will never hurt you," as in I will protect you from the vampires. So again, they're drawing from interesting themes here. Demolition Lovers, obviously, you have a kind of Bonnie and Clyde relationship going on, two lovers against the world. But there isn't the thing that is lacking is this sort of angst about I love you, but you don't love me. There is a kind of maybe a kind of slight self-pitying element to some of the songs. You think of something like Cubicles, which is one of their more traditional emo-y songs. That song is about the world. I feel alienated from the world, but it's just does not expressed in the same way as many other bands are. I'm alienated from the world, yes, but that's not the fault of a woman, not the fault of a girl. It's not the fault of a partner that stood me up or anything like that. So it keeps it much fresher. The album still today sounds pretty fresh, and it hasn't aged particularly poorly. It's not one of these albums from the era, which will as we go through the various different albums we're going to be talking about, some have aged better than others. Bullets has definitely aged very nicely, and none of these songs were going to cross over. There's no real pop here. There's melody, yes, but there's no real pop that the band would later go on to. So the album is a great first step. Very eccentric, very much My Chemical Romance, but what was to come later would take this and then turn it into something a little bit more digestible, but still keeping this very, very strong initial identity they had. The modest underground success of Bullets definitely got them a lot of attention. You're not talking success in terms of gigantic sales, but it certainly got them a lot of attention. A lot of eyeballs, no pun intended, were on them. So this obviously led to their major deal, which led to Three Cheers for Sweet Revenge. And this is where things start to get really interesting. This is really all about them taking this initial eccentricity and polishing it down. I don't think it's a surprise that Howard Benson was the producer for this. Very interesting comparison here. Jeff Rickley, who recorded their first album, very much a scene kind of guy, the scene guy, the frontman of the most important band of that initial kind of very, very early emo wave. So this is a dude that knows everyone. He's in his own successful band. He's integrated into the community around him. This is a scene guy, a localized guy, which is what they needed at the time for Bullets. They needed someone that really had that understanding of the world around them to get them started. Howard Benson is a completely different beast. Howard Benson is a lifelong music producer of an enormous array of different artists. Pop, mainstream, rock, you name it, he's done it. He's very much an industry guy. So this isn't someone coming out of a small localized scene and using those connections to get you by. This is someone that knows the industry. So this is where his pop understanding comes in and his understanding of the industry. You guys have got the ideas, I'm going to make it work. So we see this shift from them into writing singles, which is a really, really key thing. Writing singles and the look during Bullets, they're honestly kind of wearing whatever. There's footage back there of Frankie Aero actually wearing like cut-off shorts, like board shorts, which is extremely funny. So this isn't they're not even really wearing skinny jeans, just regular blue jeans. A lot of the time they'll wear band t-shirts. Gerard would often wear like a Motorhead t-shirt or something. Ray had loads of different Iron Maiden t-shirts that he'd wear. But they're just sort of wearing whatever. They're just dudes getting on stage. Gerard does have a little bit more thought into him. He is wearing his black leather jacket quite often. This dramatically changes with Three Cheers, and the look becomes essentially unified. Most of them had outfits that they would wear. Obviously, there'd be slight variations, but you have the red, the black, the white, the suit, the tie, Frank with his kind of bulletproof vest, the bulletproof vest, and then the dress shirt, Ray's red shirt, and then Gerard's kind of that suit he would wear, initially with kind of this striped black tie, and then with the red tie, the one we're more familiar with, and of course the black bat belt buckle, kind of the finishing touch. So they're moving into a much, much different direction now, and this look comes about from their videos. In the I'm Not Okay video, they're not wearing these outfits. They're actually still in the transition stage. I'm Not Okay being the first single. They're actually still wearing kind of whatever, and Gerard is in his sort of suit. Like I say, he doesn't have the red tie yet. He's got a sort of black striped tie on him. They're moving in that direction. The Helena video is what really cements this, and they would go on to wear the Helena video outfits for essentially the rest of this entire era. Gerard Way's role, I think, is interesting here. This is where his work as a comic book artist really starts to bleed through. An obvious point being that he does the artwork for this album. It's actually quite striking that he didn't draw a cover for Bullets. He's an extremely proficient comic book artist. He'd been a comic book artist since his teenagers. Obviously, he was working at Cartoon Network, very much a fairly successful, if early on in his career, comic book artist, sort of making his way up. But he really takes this comic book eye and turns it on his own band now. So we have these kind of varying personas that he would go through. He's playing characters on this album. Assassins, vampire boys, mafiosos, himself in a song like Helena. He's very much going through different ideas. And yes, the album is a concept album, but as they themselves have kind of said, it's sort of half concept and half talking about their own life, talking about other elements, talking about the scene. That there's a kind of element of responding to their rise on this album. But the point is that Gerard allows himself to play very, very distinct personas on this album in a way that really maximizes the look. And the rest of the band as well are much more involved in this scene of them as like a gang. There is a degree of forethought going on here. This is what we're going to do. We're going to be a much more tight unit than we were previously. The gender fluidity also, it's impossible not to mention this album without that. With Gerard referencing blurred sexuality and overtly referencing cross-dressing and such. And what they do to guys like us in prison. It's kind of goading you. It's goading you into these sorts of transgression, which Obviously, in 2024, there's much more robust, muscular expressions of blurred lines and gender identity out there. For 2004, for coming out of the emo scene, pretty forward thinking, really forward thinking even, and this kind of blurring of the lines. Gerard singing from the perspective of a woman, which is something he'll quite often do, questioning his sexuality or being forced into these different roles, like being forced to dress in drag and such. The characters really come through, and obviously we know there's an element of Gerard's own interest in playing with gender on a personal level there. And then just contrasting this with the dull scene politics at the time. There was some interesting, I wouldn't call a band like Thursday, for instance, as mundane or uninteresting, but it's certainly very dudes in jeans. So the fact that they are cottoning onto these ideas really does push them ahead of the crowd. And even to this day, it's why they're so relevant still. They really had an eye for discussing these kind of themes when lots of other people just weren't interested. And being slightly facetious, obviously, but My Chemical Romance were certainly a step above everyone else in terms of giving people a fresh, vibrant expression of identity. The songs ultimately become much, much more punchy. We're talking everything transferring into 3:30 classic rock tracks, pretty grandiose themes, but they become much, much more digestible and direct and poppy. They're a bit less busy. They're a bit less, you could say, messy in a complimentary way to Bullets. That's not a knock at it, but it's kind of very sprawling a lot of the time. Bullets, there's a lot going on in a lot of different instruments. Three Cheers is much more honed. The best examples obviously being the singles. I'm Not Okay being the first release, which is just a really rock solid candy of pop punk emo. It really kind of exemplifies what was going on, what would kind of happen to the scene. You know, you have this band that Bullets is an undeniably emo album, but I'm Not Okay is also very obviously not classic emo. It's got an enormous dollop of pop punk in there. Probably the most pop punk song MCR ever wrote. But it was just what people wanted. It really hit the spot in a big way. And to this day, obviously, it's unavoidable that the very first song My Chemical Romance played when they came back for their reunion was I'm Not Okay, which I can definitely understand. It's the song that the large chunk of their fan base heard first. Poppy, easily digestible, fantastic video, moving them in this much more characterful direction. The video taking a lot of influence from Wes Anderson's Rushmore, which is Frank Iera's favourite film, one of my favourite films, if not my favourite as well. That's the case for an enormous amount of emo and pop punk band members and fans. But it's taking that idea, this sort of private school, slightly kind of Anglophile, which is the idea, which is certainly not alien to My Chemical Romance. And then obviously we come to Helena, the most iconic MCR video, I would argue. I remember when I saw this, I saw about a 5 or 6 second clip. I must have seen it on some video or something, just a couple of seconds on their TV. And I was so struck by it that I would play it again and again in my mind. Just these couple of seconds. Obviously, this is before I was getting on the internet properly and could search this stuff out properly. But I remember that I was so struck by those initial images that I saw. And then obviously you come to The Ghost of You, the D-Day beaches. We're talking Hollywood, war, death, destruction, very, very ambitious, an enormously expensive video, the kind of video that they were certainly maximizing the budget they were given for this major label album. And you can't knock them for that. They certainly did it right. There was no half-arsing things here in terms of maximizing what they could do with a major label. And again, adding a little bit of variety here. You've got a very poppy first single, an anthemic second single, and then a quite mournful, gnashing third single with The Ghost of You. Again, adding in the variety. So there's so many images here to deal with. This is something I'll come back later, that they were giving their fans a world to live in through these images. They're short little videos. You're talking about maybe 10 minutes of content across all three videos. but this had such a huge impact on their fans. It was so dramatic what they were offering. It was a world you could buy into and a world you could live in. You know, you can make art, you can write fan fiction, you can imagine yourself in these worlds as part of these worlds, which is light years ahead of what most other bands were offering at the time. The band's cultural roots also come across in a big way on this album. They're an interesting band in that they do have a very distinct, almost like ethnic identity to them. One of the facts that a lot of people know about My Chemical Romance is that they're a kind of like Catholic band. They deal with Catholic images. The distinct breakdown of the members is fairly interesting. Gerard Way, the Way brothers, Gerard and Mikey, being half Scottish, half Italian, Frankie Aero being half Polish, half Italian, and then Ray Toro being of Puerto Rican descent. Obviously, all of those identities sort of bar Scottish, but there's certainly a lot of Scottish Catholics. There's more of a kind of split there in Scotland between Protestants and Catholics. This is all, you know, a band full of Catholic roots and Catholic identity, which comes across in a big way. Now, I don't get me wrong. I don't know the religious beliefs of the band members, and I'm sure that they'd be quite prosaic if we did know. I'm not saying that they are Catholics or that this is a Christian band, but the identity is there, and the identity is something that they are playing with and using for this music. On the first album, you have the invocation of Our Lady of Sorrows, a Catholic icon of the Virgin Mary. The Helena is a video filmed in a church, and then on the album itself, there's a rosary on the CD. You know, there's nothing subtle here. This is very, very obvious. Particularly, I was also brought up a Roman Catholic, so they're very, very familiar with these images. And it means you have this contrast between their transgressive playing with identity and sexuality versus this arch reactionary Catholic imagery, very rooted, very historic Catholic imagery. And the tension between the two is part of the power of this album. You have the broken individual straining against the world that surrounds them. There's a kind of maybe superego of the Catholic Church versus the id of the kind of broken, torn, depressed, anxious, angry individual. The memento mori, the idea that yes, one day you will die, the last rites, the afterlife. It's very effectively deployed by a band that know what they're doing and know the tradition they come from. I do also want to go back and think a little bit more about the geographic background of the band. They all grew up in New Jersey. They were billed as being from Newark, but I think there's some controversy about whether that's actually legitimate or not. Newark being made famous by The Sopranos, of course. But The Sopranos deals with, in some way, the kind of same things that My Chemical Romance are. There's this kind of, you know, we have the overt, the regular world, and then underneath the seedy underbelly. And this is something that My Chemical Romance were very aware of. This isn't really a middle-class band. This is a problem I have with a lot of music journalists, or some music journalists who dislike the band, particularly historically, would often pigeonhole them as a middle-class whining band. There are bands, and I might go into this later on other podcasts, that do have a fairly solidly middle-class background. I think Blink-182 is an obvious one, as an example of bands that come from a middle-class background, and because of that, are able to speak to a middle-class American audience. My Chemical Romance are not from that background. Ray Toro speaks quite vividly in the Life on the Murder Scene documentary of how there's a local pond near him that will be used as a dumping ground for dead bodies. Gerard Way, obviously, growing up, was robbed at gunpoint, which left him with a lifelong fear, but I think a fascination with firearms. The bands, if you hear them talk, I would definitely encourage listening to or watching the Life on the Murder Scene documentary for a window into this world. You see their kind of family houses. The background is very much not on the poverty line, but blue-collar, working-class backgrounds with parents that encourage the artistic interests of the band members. But this is not a band that were removed from the difficulties of the world, removed from the kind of seedy underbelly of the world. So in that sense, the struggle they talk about is authentic. They're talking about a danger that they are not immune to and that they're not ignorant of, which I think is important. It's important to recognize that, this distinct background that the band come from. And like I say, My Chemical Romance definitely come out more as a band that knew what it was like to kind of struggle in the world. Coming up to the kind of final few points I want to make about this album, obviously we have the impact of 9/11. The impact of 9/11 on My Chemical Romance as a project. This is something that, like I said about the kind of Catholicism is fairly well known about the band. The idea that they were formed as a response to 9/11, which is completely true. Again, I would encourage watching Life on the Murder Scene to understand this a bit more, because it had a profound emotional impact on the band members. Gerard Way in particular, working in New York City at the time, on his way to work when the towers fell, and watching the emotional responses of the people around him. Terror, anger, confusion, a personal worry about friends and family that might have been in the towers or near the towers. I would definitely encourage watching the interviews that Gerard and the band have given about this era. It's very influential and important to understand them as a post 9/11 band, and as a band responding to that era. Now, they're not responding to the attacks as such. There's obviously a couple of early sunsets over Monroeville, which is Skylines and Turnstiles as well. I always believe those two songs always give me a very explicit 9/11 kind of vibe to them. But this is what I'm saying. The songs, they're not necessarily writing songs about the attacks themselves, but they are responding to this feeling of the world around you crashing into dust suddenly and leaving you to pick up the pieces. 3 Cheers comes out in 2004. The war on terror was just getting started here. The attacks, obviously, 2001, September the 11th, comes at the end of 2001. 2002 is really a year of confusion, a year of picking up pieces, attempting to put things back together. And certainly politically, this is where you have the run-up to the Iraq War. The Iraq War launches in 2003. So that's the year before 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge. We are in the middle of the initial response to 9/11 here globally. We have the Madrid train bombing, and we have London 7/7 came the year after this album. These are all attacks that happen in the years surrounding 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge. It's still ongoing. There was a terror of the next 9/11, the next 7/7 happening. And this was soaked into the era. And because of that, music is a way to escape from and make sense of this. You know, when this album came out, many of the teenagers had witnessed 9/11 and understood 9/11 had happened, and were now in a world trying to make sense of what was going on. Now, again, just like the band, this wasn't teenagers sitting in their rooms thinking about 9/11 and saying, maybe this album can help me figure it out. But as a reflection to the confusion of the world around them and the confusion that they felt in their own lives being teenagers, I think it's very important to understand this album in that context. And then moving in the opposite direction, obviously, we've just spoken about the roots of the album, the legacy of the album. So 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge remains impactful. It's one of the 2 most important My Chemical Romance album, the other being The Black Parade, which I will be talking about in a later podcast. This album's got a real cult following. It's one, I would argue, one of the archetypal cult albums. Obviously mainstreamly popular, but the motor that this album had and still has to inspire a fan base is incredible. There's a real underground interest in this album. And I say underground as in young people coming into this, not being exposed to it through the mainstream, but through their peers, through art, through media, getting into My Chemical Romance through the things that are connected to this album. The strengths of imagery, the purpose that the band had, as I've said, the music videos, the songs themselves, the lyrics, the emotional honesty and the emotional complexity that this album has. It's not a simple album. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot of different ways you can read the album and the songs. This all contributed to a world that you could live in. I tell a story, I think in the accompanying essay to this, about being on Instagram in around, I think it was 2018. It was pre-reunion, so My Chemical Romance were very much a post, they'd finished, they were done. My Instagram has the For You feed, or certainly at the time had, where it would show you things that you were vaguely interested in. So I think because I probably followed Mikey Way or something on Instagram, my For You feed would have My Chemical Romance content. And it was very obvious that a lot of teenagers were still there posting My Chemical Romance content. It reminded of us back in the day, posting about this band, and people would be logging on every single day in 2018, posting images of the band from Warped Tour 2005. Every single day, people logging on with Frankie Aero fan accounts, Gerard Way fan accounts, to relive this era every single day, which is mind-blowing. It's like, I suppose it would be like our generation reliving the 60s or Woodstock or something. It had an enormous weight to people, and it had a gravitational pull, My Chemical Romance, and this album certainly, of getting new people into it and wanting to live in the world of it. Something that I've always loved about My Chemical Romance's fan base is how artistic it is. There's an enormous number of artists in this fan base. You go on DeviantArt. DeviantArt, certainly back in the day, was enormously important. Anywhere where art is posted online, there's new My Chemical Romance art being made. There's fanfic being made. People love this stuff and they want to interact with it. And that's honestly the main powerful legacy of this album, is getting people to want to live in it so much and get to engage with its themes consistently. And that's why it remains so important 20 years after its release. So as a kind of a final personal reflection, so as I mentioned, I was raised a Roman Catholic. I went to a Catholic school in central London in the noughties. I actually started school in 2004, started high school in 2004, the year this album came out. A couple of months after that, I started in September. So this album is deeply, deeply intertwined with my teenage years. Like I said, the themes that were going on about terror, the fear of terror, the confusion of the world, the early internet, discovering yourself, creating an identity for yourself as an early teenager. This is deeply wrapped up in this album, and my teenage years are saturated with memories of this. The band really wanted to guide their fan base, and in that they dramatically succeeded, certainly with me and with people I know. I'm very proud to say I have quite a few friends from my teenage years that I'm still friends with and still meet up with. And most of them who liked MCR still very much like MCR. They certainly guided us through our teenage years very successfully, and in a productive, uplifting way, which is what any MCR fan will tell you. This band are about getting through things together, getting through difficulties together, and getting through the world together. This is why it's still relevant. The people that loved it back in the day, many of them still love it. Obviously, some people grow out. No harm in that. Maybe you only need a guide for a certain amount of time before you can walk on your own. I think of early Flash websites when I think of this album. I remember I went onto the Wayback Machine and I was looking through My Chemical Romance's old websites I would have gone on myself back in the day. Obviously, with the Flash has been deprecated now. Websites don't use Flash anymore, but there's still some functionality available with the old websites of theirs. Powerful images. I definitely went on that website myself back in the day. MySpace, Pure Volume, a whole realm of the internet. It's kind of a bit of a graveyard now, or certainly a graveyard. Yeah, this album definitely hits a lot of deep, deep points for me. It goes beyond a nostalgia. I don't like that word, nostalgia. Part of the bricks of growing up, part of what makes you who you are, and saturated into those teenage memories. So I'll always love this album. 3 cheers for Sweet Revenge.